Hi all. We are going to be talking about imagery today, and we will be breaking this down into two parts. The first part will be talking about the imagery debate, and the second part is going to be talking about interactions across modalities. And when we talk about modalities, we mean visual versus auditory. So if I were to ask you to first think about who wrote the Gettysburg Address, where the fuel gauge is in your car or a car that you ride in regularly. And then also think about how many windows are visible from the front of your house. You initially used no imagery, then a little bit of imagery, and then a lot of imagery. So the idea about mental imagery and how it is represented in mind has led to what's called the imagery debate. So this is kind of an abstract concept, but if you think about mental images as being a representation, an analog representation of your past experience, the idea with this camp of researchers is that our perceptual world is consistent with our imagined world. So therefore it's based on spatial mechanisms, meaning this. If I asked you to stand in front of the house you grew up in and tell me how many windows are on the front, you could do that. But then if I asked you to walk up to the front door with your stomach touching the doorknob and tell me if you could see the windows, most people would say they can't see the windows because now they're too close. So that would be an example of an analog representation, meaning that the restrictions that I have when I move around in the real world are also the restrictions that I have in my mental image. So that's one camp of individuals that believe that. The other camp are individuals that are saying we do not have an analog representation based on past experience. However, imagery instead is based on processing of language. So the idea is that the mental image that you get is an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of processing language. So if you think about, if every time I try to think really hard about answering a question and my eyes roll up to the back of my head, it doesn't mean that I'm scanning my brain looking for an answer. It just means that when I think really hard, I look up to the sky. And that would be an epiphenomenon. So keep in mind as we talk about this that the one camp says there are spatial mechanisms and that's what imagery is based on, whereas the other camp says that it's more of a propositional mechanism where language is processed and then imagery is something that comes forth after the language is processed. So which of these two different approaches have the most empirical support, meaning the data to support? The problem that has been in studying imagery is that it's really introspective, meaning that if I ask you to think about the windows in the front of the house you grew up in, you could say, yeah, I'm doing that, but maybe you're thinking about cheeseburgers. I have no way to test that. So that has been a real problem with testing mental imagery. Until along comes Roger Shepard, who he wakes up one morning and instead of just being groggy like I normally am, he has this flash of insight, by the way, which is one of the things that got him the Nobel Prize for Science. So as we are talking about Roger, you should have a real feel for this because this is very similar to the Cog Lab that you just did. So he had this idea about showing people a structure or an image and then a comparator image. And he asked people to determine if the two were same or different. In doing this, he would measure their reaction time. And what he consistently found across multiple studies is that the further out of plane or degree of rotation one item was from the other, the longer it took someone to make the same different response. So that was really the first study that presented a way that we could actually empirically test mental rotation, which actually empirically tested imagery. Here's just a picture of people making these same different decisions, and you can see the visual cortex is activated more when the two comparator items are further out of phase. So it's a more difficult process, which is requiring more mental imagery. So he used this as a way to really think about how it is that people hold in mind different information. So again, that had been replicated many times, and there has been a lot of work subsequently. One thing we know is that familiar objects are rotated more easily and quicker than objects that we're not familiar with. People with less spatial ability takes them twice as long to make the same different decision as people with better spatial ability. So I am one of those people, and an example would be that I have to use a GPS to find my way around, whereas people that have really good spatial ability often don't have to do that. They understand where they are in space. I don't even know which elevator to get off of when I am in the Urban Life building, even though I've been doing that for many years. So this mental rotation test would indicate whether you have good or poor spatial ability. This has also been tested, showing that there are differences in spatial ability and processing for men versus women. There are gender differences. Women generally do not do mental rotation tasks as well as men. Oftentimes it's tied to estrogen fluctuations. Homosexual men also perform at about the same level as heterosexual women. And then there have been studies looking at transsexual patients showing that brain activity is different than controls. And so regardless, all of these sort of studies show that there are some innate brain differences with regard to gender that influence this mental rotation ability. So what else do we know about mental rotation and the analog data view? Well, Moyer was the first one to really look at this idea of imagery and size. So it's the idea that if we actually are using mental images based on the real world and spatial mechanisms, then things that are physically large should seem physically large in our mental image. So the way he tested this was to show people different comparators. So if you want to do this really quickly, which is bigger, a cow or a squirrel, a duck or a pig, a ferret or a rabbit, a horse or a deer, a rhino or a snake. And so what he found with this is that the larger difference between the two comparator animals, the quicker people could make the response. And so he used this as data to say, look, indeed, we have this mental imagery. We compare these two animals and to make the decision. Well, if you think about it, probably the only one that you had to do a comparator for in mind would be the ferret or the rabbit, because who knows which is bigger. However, for a cow or squirrel, you probably didn't have to hesitate and make a mental comparison. Everybody knows a cow is bigger than a squirrel. Otherwise, it would be a pretty scary squirrel. So the people on the propositional end of the camp say, yep, that is not proving anything. People already have semantic information about rhinos versus snakes. Rhinos are always bigger than snakes. Therefore, they don't need the mental image to make this decision. It's a byproduct. So along comes Coslin with a different way to try to test this. And Coslin has done a lot of different studies. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them here. One is that if we are again thinking about this sort of analog representation, he argued that large objects are generally easy to see relative to a small object. So if you think about, you go to the zoo, you're standing outside of the rhino pavilion. Rhinos are really big. You can still see details about the rhino, but if he has a bird sitting on his back, it's really hard to see much about the bird because the bird's really small. So with that idea in mind, he set out to do a study. And he did something called a mental zoom lens study, where he would vary the context that people would use and then ask them to make decisions about one of the images. So He would ask people, for example, imagine an elephant standing next to a rabbit, and in your mental zoom lens, the elephant is really large, the rabbit's really small, and then he would ask something that you would semantically already know. Does the rabbit have a beak? Well, of course we know the answer is no. So then he would change the context, all sorts of different ways. Imagine a rabbit standing next to a fly, and then he would ask something that you wouldn't necessarily know. Does the rabbit have an eyebrow? Well, I don't know if a rabbit has an eyebrow, so now I have to zoom in and look. However, because the rabbit is large relative to the fly, I could make that decision quickly. He would change the context, however, and say, now I want to see a really large fly next to a small rabbit, and would ask questions that are very similar, so then it would take you longer to zoom in to look at the rabbit to see whether or not he had an eyebrow. So the findings from this across the board was that as he changed the context of these comparator items, it took people longer to make those detailed decisions when they had to blow the animal up relative to the comparator. If it was already large, it was easy to see. So his data were also consistent with the analog approach. But again, we get the propositional folks are saying, nope, I don't believe it. You already know things about animals, you know whether or not a rabbit has an eyebrow, and so they shot holes in his theory. The next thing he came up with was testing this fictional island. So this was the idea that, all right, we're going to try to test how long it takes someone to get from point A to point B across this island, and if this is a imagined island, you shouldn't have any semantic information about it. So he would ask people to mentally stand at one end of this island where the trees are, and then he would say, push a button when you get over to the little house. And so he would measure that. And so he would go back and forth having people mentally traverse these different parts of the island. And when they reached their destination, they would make a response, and he would measure the reaction times. And it was consistent with everything else that is found in the analog world, meaning that if it takes me a long time to run from point A to point B, then mentally it would take me a long time to mentally run from point A to point B relative to a shorter distance. And here's the results there. These data look perfect. So because there were still propositional folks that said, no, you can hold in mind this information about the map, and with that, you could make the decisions about how long it takes you to get from point A to point B and just respond in kind. So finally, Fink and Pinker come up with a different idea. And there was no semantic information and no way that anybody could use past experience to make this decision. And what they did is they would show this figure A, as you can see, with the 4 dots, and then they would show them that screen, and then there would be a delay, and like 2 seconds later they would show figure B. And so that would have an arrow that would have changed to where it's pointing, and the person would have to determine whether or not it had been pointing at one of the dots that was seen previously. So this requires a person to mentally pull up the image of the first screen to determine whether or not this arrow could have been pointing at one of the dots. So this was an example of pure analog representation. And so from this, most researchers now support this idea of a spatial mechanism. There is a lot of replication, a lot of different studies. Of course, there's a small camp of people that still side with the propositional approach, which is this idea that imagery is still based on language. However, that's a very small camp. And that's all for the mental imagery debate.